welcome Dr. Paul.
Thank you, Nada. I think I'll start out with a series of slides just to orient you to the images that I've collected that are so expressive and illustrative of Chadwick himself and some of the themes that I'll expand on for the course of the evening. So I came to Santa Cruz to teach in 1966. It was the second year of the campus, and it was on this pristine landscape. I had a church history teacher at Harvard Divinity School, George Huntston Williams, who had written a book called Wilderness and Paradise. Translate desert and garden. And he explores the themes of wilderness and paradise as inspired by the biblical tradition in Western culture. And the second half of the book is about the origins of the university in the United States and how pioneers went out from New England under the biblical directives of wilderness and paradise and planted a garden to start a school. And he details that as an historical fact and a historical movement. So I had him as a church history professor. I even helped him a little on the book. It's the first time my name is mentioned in a book. Should I use that? My voice isn't big enough? Okay. And so when I got to the Santa Cruz campus, it was clear that it was the end of the wilderness, and yet it was still this wonderful paradise space nestled in redwoods overlooking Monterey Bay. So I'd been involved with the Leary group at Harvard, and half apologetic to reveal. And so flower power was in the air. It was wafting down on a cloud from the Haight-Ashbury, and we all got a whiff of that. So I thought that it would be a wonderful project to get the students involved in a garden as an expression of flower power. It was the theme of the late 60s. And so I proposed it to the chancellor, and he was agreeable. And so we went on a walk. And that's me carrying my daughter on my shoulders as we look for a possible site for a student garden project. I didn't want a garden. I like the idea of a garden. I thought it would be a good thing for the students to do. And then I could go and smell the flowers and whatever. But I thought the students would be agreeable to doing the work of developing a garden on this great landscape. And so that's the kind of group that went its way through the back area of the university looking for a possible site. And finally, Chadwick arrived about 2 or 3 weeks later, as though on schedule. I like to think he was divinely ordained to drop onto the campus at this very point. There was a remarkable woman visiting the campus, Countess Freya von Moltke, the widow of Helmut von Moltke, one of the great resistors to Hitler in the Second World War, who was executed toward the end of the war in his complicity with the officer bomb plot, which he actually didn't take part in. He was against assassination, not on legal grounds. Anyhow, she was a magnificent woman. She had been Chadwick's muse. They had gotten to know one another in South Africa, where she had fled after Germany fell, and he was coming to visit her. So she came to lunch, and she said, "Paul, I hear you want to start a garden. I have somebody coming to visit me, and he will do your garden for you." I said, "Okay, Thomas." And so Chadwick arrived about a week later. I met him at Cowell College, and we shook hands. I said, "Will you do our garden for us?" He said, "Yes, I will." We, said a few things, but not much. And I remember mentioning that the garden would probably function as a therapy station for students on drugs. I just thought to tell him that. He didn't know what I was talking about at all. And that, in fact, is what happened. A lot of students recovered themselves by repairing to the garden to, start over again. And Chadwick was very patient and helpful in doing that. The next day, he went out and bought a spade and picked out a slope without speaking to anybody, not to me either, and started to dig. I was driving up to class, and I caught him out of the corner of my eye, and I thought, there he is, digging on that slope. Here we go. And so the garden began. And he worked something like 18 hours a day, 7 days a week for 2 years before I thought it was time to tell him to take a weekend off. And from that, I started to think this guy's been ordained from on high, like I said, to replant the vital root of existence in the late stage of the self-destruction of industrial society as the world above the given world of nature, and therefore devoid of vital roots. I have a slightly orotund impulse toward such formulations, but I'm sorry, I can't help it. Because there was something so, I don't know, so passionately driven about the guy. And he didn't ask for anything, he simply went ahead and did it. And I had to recruit students to assist him and to pick up the work of the garden. And he never asked for any money. We finally got him a small salary. I think he eventually got $400 a month. And so he simply dedicated himself to establishing this first strictly organic garden on a university campus in the country, as far as I know. So this is when he was an actor in his theater career in London, which was a fairly distinguished career. We have reviews of some of the plays he was in. And he then went into the Second World War and was on a minesweeper, suffered a nervous breakdown and a broken back, and really never quite recovered from that and repaired to gardening because he had a hard time dealing with people. He became a classic neurasthenic, which is an old psychiatric term for shattered nerves. And Freya von Moltke told me that he was difficult. Well, we had to find out the hard way. So he was subject to terrible, terrible temper tantrums and fits of temper. But people tended to ride with it, and we got through it. This is the first broadside that Jack Stoffaker designed for our garden project. Jack is a disciple of Goethe. And here we had a Goethe gardener on our campus, Chadwick. Because what Chadwick represented was a tradition that went back to Goethe and came through Rudolf Steiner to himself. It was Goethe to Steiner to Chadwick. Rudolf Steiner, I don't know, have any of you heard Rudolf Steiner? You know about him? You know, he's a fairly esoteric figure in Western culture. He was a clairvoyant, which tended to, push him out. He was adept in the occult, and really one of the most extraordinary, multifaceted figures in the early part of the 20th century in Europe. And Steiner was a devoted student of Goethe. When he was a young man, I think he was only about 21 years old, he already exhibited extraordinary powers of scholarship and so on. He was asked to work on the scientific writings of Goethe at the Weimar Archive. Well, a lot of people didn't even know Goethe had a scientific side. Goethe was very adept in botany and botanical studies. He was very adept in minerals. He was head of the Bureau of Mines for a while. And so Steiner went ahead to develop the Goethe archive regarding Goethe's scientific writings. Out of that, and an attention paid to Goethe's botany, Steiner developed biodynamics as a system of food and flower production, which is strictly organic, based on very sophisticated composting techniques and so on. And that's what Chadwick brought to Santa Cruz. Now, this is the vitalist tradition. That's what Goethe, Steiner, Chadwick represented, as opposed to the physicalist tradition, determined by mathematical physics and organic chemistry, and determining also what counts for knowledge. I mean, that's the knowledge system of the university, pure and simple. So the vitalist tradition, I'll go into later in terms of why it went out and how it had to be brought back, and how I see it as representing the integrity of organic nature. So Chadwick was a force fit. He kept his mouth shut. He didn't mention Steiner much at all in the early years, because he could see that somehow everything Steiner represented was antithetical or inimical to what was being taught at the university, and especially with reference to Davis, the agricultural campus, that was strictly industrial in the approach to food and flower production. So I met Jack Stauffacher in the early part of 1970, I think it was, Jack. I'm happy to say that he's here tonight. We've been colleagues and close comrades in this entire Chadwick enterprise ever since we first met. And he was delighted to come to Santa Cruz with his wife Josephine and have lunch and meet Chadwick, the Goethean Steinerite gardener. And so in response to our project in Santa Cruz, he designed this broadside. And what we did was to take the slogan of Goethe in his famous Italian journey. It was a slogan that was popular in Europe in the 18th and 19th century. Et in Arcadia ego, and in Arcadia I am. Arcadia being the Western Greek version of Eden. You have these kind of two garden motifs that come through Western culture. One from the biblical source, from Genesis, and one from the Greek source. Basically, Virgil's what? Virgil's Georgics. So Virgil's Georgics is what celebrates Arcadia. And Arcadia is this kind of barren land in Greece where shepherds scrub out their living. And in their song, they kind of rise above, they transcend themselves in the kind of expression of a spiritual landscape through their poetry. And that's what Virgil celebrated. So, because it was a slogan of Goethe's Italian journey, and it brings up this notion of an Arcadian affirmation, what it really means is the retrospective affirmation of the goodness and sweetness of life from the point of view of the grave. And I will next show you a painting by Poussin in the Louvre, which gives expression to that theme. There's a wonderful essay by Panofsky on the Arcadian affirmation. And in a way, it's a voice from the grave saying goodbye to Western culture and old Europe. It's coming to an end in the face of the rise of industrial society. So Jack did this broadside with the Arcadian theme that expressed what Chadwick and the rest of us thought basic to our venture. And then later on, some years later, actually on the 200th anniversary of Goethe's Italian journey, Jack did this broadside, designing Goethe's Italian journey, almost showing the journey and the way he designed the blocks of type. And again, the expression et in Arcadia ego. So I started taking an interest in Goethe. I'd never heard that he had any scientific side. And I was interested in his influence on Steiner, that it should lead to what Chadwick was developing at Santa Cruz, albeit somewhat under wraps. Chadwick kind of, you could almost say camouflaged the Steiner influence with what he called the French intensive system. So he amalgamated these two systems. The French intensive developed around Paris to provide Paris with the highest quality foodstuffs for the Paris market. Raised beds, double digging, yada yada. So Chadwick tended to promote that as an almost screen for the biodynamic. And once you kind of got into what Chadwick was doing and you became intimate with him and you saw what he was doing, and you started to see what he was doing with compost and the development of the fertility of soils and so on, then you were initiated into the biodynamic aspect. So Goethe was a big eye-opener for me because Goethe went up against Newton and the theory of optics. I went, what's this about? You know, the foremost poet of Europe, okay, he's got a scientific side, but to try to refute Newton on the theory of optics, theory of color. And Goethe carried on extensive experiments with prisms and whatnot. I thought, well, that's really interesting. But see, that was the whole vitalist, physicalist conflict that Goethe and Newton represented as classical types. Newton, the reduction of everything to matter, and to mathematical physics. And Goethe trying to maintain a sense of structural wholes. And he was a totally holistic thinker, and really, in a way, paved the way for holistic thinking in the late 18th century. So that was a big eye-opener. Goethe takes his Italian journey, and on his way he stops in Padua. And there he sees this palm tree that wasn't under this facade. The Paduans did that after Goethe presumably called it his Urplant. Now, this is a whole theme I can't get into tonight, but it's prototypically German and Goethean. He had some notion of a metaphysical plant that was the exemplar of all plant development. I think Goethe actually, he wrote a book called The Metamorphosis of Plants. He coined a number of specific terms for botanical studies, like morphology, and so on. So for me, as a philosophical response to this, I went to the Paduan Garden to actually see this palm tree, now under glass. I thought, okay, this is Goethe's effort to give expression to the vital root of existence. That's what he's really after. It's a kind of metaphysical rootedness that he was after because of what's coming, which he anticipated and foresaw, and for which Faust is a kind of parable. The coming industrial society and the industrial engineer. And so I thought, isn't this odd that and Padua is presumably the oldest botanical garden in the Western world. And so what should they do? But after Goethe designates this palm tree, they should build this glass case over it, as if to say, the vital root of existence was squirreled away under glass in the oldest botanical garden in the Western world to wait out the rise, triumph, and self-destruction of industrial society. So it's a kind of shrine to what Goethe had in mind, that he was trying to give expression to against the abrootedness that was to come. It's a painting by Poussin, and it's four shepherd youths looking at a tomb, and on which is the inscription, Et in Arcadia Ego. So it's a voice from the tomb saying, I too was once alive and enjoyed the goodness and sweetness of life as you now enjoy it. And so it is this affirmation from the grave of the goodness and sweetness of life. And it's a magnificent painting, so that's that. Here's some of Chadwick's plate. He came from a high-class family in England. They had a big estate called Puddleston, which had been sold before Chadwick was born, but he carried that kind of background. And there he is, working away. It was like this every day. He was there before anybody else in the morning and stayed later than anybody else at the end of the day. And he was this magnetic draw then for students who really wanted to somehow get involved with what I call a sacramental relationship to nature. They wanted to drop out from the industrial society syndrome, and they wanted to reverence nature. They wanted to understand someone who knew nature's mysteries, and that's what Chadwick provided. This gives you just a slight example of the kind of fury that he gave expression to. I mean, he worked like a madman, and there was very few students. I've only known one or two that were able to keep up with him. And what's so funny is that so many of the students that stumbled in to work with him had never worked before in their lives. They just didn't know how to work, and Chadwick taught them how to work, and what really hard work gardening is, and how to do it. And so he developed a slope at the entrance to the campus that became magnificent. I went up in the mornings, just after sunrise, to pick flowers in order to put them out at a kiosk across the street for the university community to pick up to take to their offices or their dorm rooms. Everything was given away. Chadwick represented an economy of gift, and I learned it from him. Namely, you have it to give it away, and there's always more to give away if that's your attitude. Too much zucchini. That's been the case, that he acted on that, and he gave expression to it, and everybody was influenced by it that caught the spirit of it. So I set it up for him to give a series of lectures in the quarry at the university. You know, people call him a ham. He was so theatrical and, you know, just really, you know, he'd come on to give a talk and he'd start out by saying, "Greetings," you know, and half the people would wince and half the people would get a kick out of it. But he just took out, you know, he pulled out all the stops in his theatrical training. He had incredible diction. So his voice and his speaking was something of extremely commanding nature. And he gave terrific talks. You often didn't know what he was talking about, but you were just swept away by his whole manner and what he had to say. One of his signature pieces was the nuptial flight of the queen bee, which he would enact. You know, and once you saw him do that, you were ready to follow him anywhere. I mean, this guy has really got, you know, something unusual. So these quarry lectures were a high point in his period at the university, and Jack Stopker and Josephine brought friends from San Francisco up to hear Chadwick, and then we'd have lunches at the Holler's Restaurant, which my wife and I started for the garden to supply. And it was just a halcyon moment. It was just terrific because somehow everything, it was grand and glorious and self-transcending about what Chadwick was doing came into expression over these Saturdays. You know, I got into my head to read the Smokey the Bear Sutra of Gary Snyder and have Chadwick present Smokey the Bear with a spade. That's this. That's my dad in a bear outfit. So that was fun. And you know, Chadwick was full of fun and willing to play along with stunts like that. There he is on his Raleigh bicycle cutting the remarkable figure that he cut on the campus that people just took in, you know, wondering, wow, look at that guy. It's a car somebody gave him, just almost as a joke, on which it said, "This too can be yours." And that's Chadwick lecturing. That's one of the bun fights on the garden chalet deck where students gathered to dine every noon. That's that's Chadwick with Josephine Stoffaker, Jack's wife. And there he is lecturing and teaching one of the students. And again, this is the iconic photo taken by one of the students at the time where he is the green man, nature boy personified, sitting among the delphiniums. And it's the prized photo of the collection. And this is Richard Wilson, where Chadwick went in Cobolo. Wilson was his patron in the northern part of the state and developed a whole apprentice training center in Cobolo. And this is a visit that Ronald Reagan gave when he came to Cobolo and met Chadwick, one actor to another. And this is the four of us. That's Wilson on the left, Paige Smith, my great colleague at Santa Cruz, me and Chadwick in Cobolo. And I found out that there was this children's garden army at the early part of the last century, about 1906, 1907. It was a national effort. And I found this poster and thought, well, yeah, that was an early example of Chadwick. Follow the Pied Piper, and that's the kind of magnetic draw he had on the whole student generation at Santa Cruz. This is a broadside that Jack did when we gathered together with Chadwick just before he died. He was brought back to Green Gulch where he developed a garden before he went to Cobolo. And he had gone on from Cobolo to West Virginia and was dying of cancer of the prostate. He was brought back to Green Gulch thanks to Richard and Virginia Baker. Virginia's here tonight, one of our oldest and dearest friends who went through the whole Chadwick enterprise together with us. And Jack did this broadside to commemorate that event when we gathered with Chadwick for the last time before he died. And when he died, he put this sonnet of Shakespeare next to his bed, along with the Pietà of Raphael and a vase of flowers, and then he fell over dead. When I consider everything that grows holds in perfection but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment. When I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the selfsame sky, vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory. Then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most rich in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay, to change your day of youth to sullied night. All in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. Now, isn't it amazing that Shakespeare should have written a sonnet just for Chadwick? And this is Page Smith's eulogy. Chadwick, it's a little too long to read. We went on to do a land reform conference inspired by Chadwick, didn't lead anywhere. And this is one of the last photos of Chadwick before he died. So that runs you through the slides. And, oh, that's a good one. There he goes. And where is brave state out of memory? That line from that sonnet, I mean, I don't know of anything that has kind of like entered me with a kind of a shock like that line. And where their brave state out of memory. Okay, so now let me turn over to Nada, and we'll have a little discussion of some of the themes that I'd like to unravel for you, and then we'll have you ask any kind of questions you like, and that'll be it.
So, Paul, in your book, you point towards a conspiracy. Would you say that there is a scientific conspiracy to undermine organic nature?
Well, it's the physicalist vitalist constant. Here's how it started. I went to dinner with a colleague. He happened to be an organic chemist. He would have had to have been. And we're stepping it off to the dinner table, and he said, Paul, you know the guard has done more to ruin the cause of science on this campus than anything else?
To ruin it?
Ruin! You know, like, ruin the cause. Wait a minute. You know, like, what are you trying to do? Ruin my appetite? Or? I thought, what does this guy mean by that? What is our garden doing? Well, it's because it was an organic garden. And he was an organic chemist. So he thought organic meant artificial synthesis. Organic was equated with artificial and synthetic. Really? How did that happen? Well, that's the beginning of organic chemistry. Well, yeah. So I went into the literature to find out what was at stake here. How did organic chemistry start? What did it mean? And the smoking gun is the first experiment that initiated organic chemistry, the artificial synthesis of urea, 1828. Fix it in your mind, folks. That's the critical date. A German chemist named Friedrich Röhler took ammonium cyanide from inorganic sources and heated it up to 100 degrees centigrade. When he thought he got organic urea and said, urea, I found it. Until then, you could only get urea from a kidney because it was an organic product. It was the nitrogen part of urine. Follow me? You didn't need a kidney anymore. Could it be that we could artificially synthesize practically anything found in organic nature if we found a chemical equivalent from the inorganic realm? Yeah. So that was the beginning of the undermining of organic nature at the hands of organic chemistry. And that's when organic became synonymous with artificial and synthetic. It's so symbolic to me that this experiment should lead to synthetic fertilizers because of nitrogen. Yeah? So you had the industrial fertilizer coming off of the synthesis of urea. And secondly, plastic, polyurethane. So you could grow plastic food in synthetic soils. As a world is above the given world of nature. Now, this was construed to be the refutation of vitalism. This experiment. What was vitalism? It was the defense of the integrity of organic nature. No, we don't want you to do that. We want to hold out there's something different between organic urea and synthetic urea. No, there's not. Chemicals are chemicals. Give it up. And so I got onto this vitalist kick about why physicalist science, which is what it became known in opposition to vitalism, reducing everything to matter. And matter is all that matters. I mean, the physical and chemical forces in matter. Why that should have been such a ruthless ideological grudge against vitalism, because they did everything possible to drive out anybody that harbored vitalist sympathies. I can tell you why. Because vitalism meant some kind of metaphysical affirmation of organic nature. It was the Arcadian Affirmation. It was God creating and saying it was good. The unambiguous affirmation of the goodness of creation. Yeah, no, come on. That's all metaphysical nonsense. We get rid of all that. We get rid of spirit. We get rid of soul. We get rid of being, metaphysics. We get rid of, finally, aesthetics and ethics. If you want to really tighten up the scientific establishment, as they did in Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century, in the Vienna Circle. Their main slogan was the elimination of metaphysics and everything that didn't make sense. Theses devoid of sense. Big project. But before that came the Physicalist Society in Berlin, after the synthesis of urea, just a couple years after the death of Goethe. And the Physicalist Society took an oath in blood, so I'm led to believe, I've never been able to run down the reference, but I can tell you where I got it from. They took an oath in blood not to take into account any forces operating in any entity but the physical, chemical forces or other forces equal in dignity. And no vital force was equal in dignity to a physical, chemical force. That was the oath taken by the physicalists in the Berlin Physicalist Society. Now, how could physicalists take an oath, let alone in blood? And what are they doing? Okay, so there's been this conspiracy. It kind of starts with Galileo. Galileo is famous for mathematizing nature. Galileo is famous for adopting Lucretian atomism, which came in at the point of the Renaissance, just for him. He can get rid of Aristotle and the whole kind of botanical, biological, life form themes of Aristotle. Resort to Plato and the mathematics of Plato, and especially the atomism of Lucretius, going back to Democritus. And that comes in right at the point of Galileo, who mathematizes nature. And that's the beginning of the takeover of mathematical physics as the primary discipline that counts for knowledge, to which then you jump to the 19th century to add organic chemistry.
So, isn't it interesting that Galileo is at the point of Renaissance, the Renaissance being thrust by Plato, the rediscovery of the ancients were brought into Cosimo Medici by Plithi, and that the Academy of Botany that begins with the Renaissance and ends with the Renaissance. Would you explain that a little bit to us?
Well, what's so extraordinary about Galileo is it's a time of botany. I mean, mathematical physics is going to take off, okay, and just, run the whole show eventually through Descartes and Newton and so on. But at the time of Galileo, you have the Renaissance expressed in great civic gardens. It's as if the medieval herb garden jumps the wall, and you have these magnificent civic botanic gardens developed in practically every major city in Europe to give expression to the Renaissance, to the rebirth of Western culture from its ancient sources that have come in now. And she makes reference to the foundation, the reestablishment of the Platonic Academy by Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. So, I mean, it's the age of botany. There's a wonderful book I've read where it calls the time the age of the plantocracy. And the guys practicing it, plantocrats. And they go all through the whole world that's opening up, thanks to Columbus, to find plants to bring back to these botanic gardens. And what happens then is that the gardens become centers for scientific academies, almost autonomous, self-developing academies, kind of free of authorities over them. They develop in these great botanic gardens. And the academies develop an astronomical observatory and a chemical laboratory in the botanic gardens. And the guys go from the garden into the lab, they don't come out again.
So Galileo is known to have been jailed by the church for having said that the sun, that we rotate around the sun, but you say it's different, that he was actually imprisoned by the church because of his argument against the sacramental integrity of nature.
Got it. Yeah, this has only come through in the last, 10 years or so. There were documents found in the Vatican where the Vatican is more worried about Galileo's atomism and its bearing on the Eucharist than they are about the Copernican issue. And to me, they had a real point, that Galileo's atomism undermines the sacramental character of the Roman Catholic Church, with a specific bearing on the transformation of the wine and bread into the body and blood of Jesus Christ through the miracle of transubstantiation. And the adoption of Lucretian atomism undermines that. So that's what the church intuited, I think, with respect to Galileo, and that's why they put the finger on it. And the Copernican thing was a kind of, a bargaining chip or a, rapprochement. I mean, they use that as kind of a cover story. So you go from Galileo to and mathematical physics, which becomes the primary discipline determining what counts for knowledge. And to that you add organic chemistry in the 19th century, and then you get the show on the road. And this is all done at the cost of vitalism. And vitalism is simply, for me, the affirmation of life. I found quotes now, just at the end point of doing this book. I found Saint-Georgi, a famous physicist, and I found Francois Jacob, a Nobel Prize winner in France, who's got a wonderful book called something about life. I forget exactly the title all of a sudden. And they say that life is not an object of scientific inquiry. And one of them says there is no such thing as life. Like, it's not conceptualizable. Forget about it. And then the guy who comments on this and gave me these quotes said, yeah, really, we should call them the death sciences, not the life sciences. That's what he says. So I'm still at a loss as to why science got into this cramp. And I think it's still a matter of case. That it's still in the cramp. I'll tell you, eventually why it's still the case.
So you follow the philosophical journey of Galileo to Newton, and then Newton and Goethe have the physicalist, vitalist conflict.
Debate, yeah.
And then somehow Steiner picks up the vitalist route along with existentialism.
Carries it through.
Tell us how then that plays out.
Well, Steiner's the cul-de-sac, which is the fate of vitalism. I mean, he just, he's nowhere, man. He develops his own thing in Dornach, his own philosophical point of view called anthroposophy, a really dumb term. Beckett parodies it in Waiting for Godot, and with the speech of Lucky, this verbal vomit that Lucky gives off, in the midst of which he goes after So Steiner is a real difficult figure to cope with in this sketch because he's a cul-de-sac. And even though, we have a Waldorf school in Santa Cruz, probably have one here. You have Steiner stuff going on worldwide, especially the biodynamic thing. That's quite lively and up and running now in various parts of the country. So Steiner lives, but it's a very difficult point of view to integrate because it's so peculiar. There's so much esoteric hoo-ha involved with it that I don't know where to go. I mean, I can't find my way. I've done what I could. I've read a lot of it. And certain aspects of it, he's got a very good history of philosophy. His autobiography is fun to read, and so on and so forth. The Camp Hill movement, where handicapped people help themselves, which he initiated. We have got one in Santa Cruz. It's all fantastic. I mean, all these various aspects of what he did. But he's a cul-de-sac. He's kind of caught out there, and there's no more to be said about it. That's the fate of the vitalist. And so what happened, I studied existentialism when I was in school, especially at Harvard, especially under Tillich and Ricoeur. And so all of a sudden it dawned on me, oh, I get it. Existentialism begins in 1841-42 with the Berlin Lectures of Schelling in his turn against Hegel. Kierkegaard is sitting in the class. Kierkegaard goes back to Denmark and then carries it through in a more radical way. Okay? Existentialism is chief mourner for defeated vitalism. Once the integrity of organic nature is undermined, once life becomes something that is conceptually meaningless, when everything is reduced to matter is all that matters, then existence becomes a major quandary in the rise of industrial society. And that's the history of existentialism, which in a way starts 1841-42, ends at Earth Day, 1970. It's a convenient way of dating the end of existentialism. So that was kind of my contribution. Nobody's ever thought that. I've never seen it anywhere in the literature. And it's a historic way of placing existentialism as a consequence of the defeated vitalism. You don't think across boundaries very easily in academia. So people don't think that a problem in the history of science has much bearing on the history of philosophy. But it does. And it does especially in this case. So once I got the theme of vitalism and its demise and its ruthless elimination, I started to think of the nails. They put vitalism in a coffin in 1828 with the synthesis of urea. They started nailing down the lid. So I started identifying the nails to carry through this physicalist onslaught. And I could give you those. But for me, when Earth Day occurred, the coffin came unglued. Just when they thought they had the lid nailed down. And the corpse of vitalism sat up and gave this terrible, terrible, terrible death rattle, which is what we call the environmental movement. That's the worst thought I've ever had. Just about. I don't like to repeat it, but I mean, and then, okay, now let me tell you this. There's this guy in England named Rupert Sheldrake. Is his name familiar to anybody here in the room? He was famous for writing a book called The New Science of Life, in which he proposes the notion of morphic resonance. It's his way of talking about consciousness. And it was just totally poo-pooed. The editor of Nature reviewed it and said that it was his major candidate for burning, which was a kind of dumb thing to say, because it made him out to be a little like Hitler, and it made Sheldrake famous overnight. Well, Sheldrake has had an interesting career. He's a pan-psychist. He's a pan-vitalist. He's my kind of major character as a neo-vitalist. He thinks everything's alive. And his latest book, in English, in its English edition, British edition, is called The Science Delusion. He goes up against Dawkins with the title, Dawkins famous for the God Delusion, and Sheldrake writes the science, and he gives the 10 dogmas of physicalism. I thought, whoa, Rupert, good for you. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a greater companion piece to what I did than Sheldrake's latest book. The 10 dogmas of physicalism, and he's up against it every day. They just lowered the boom on him for his neo-vitalist interests. You know, precognition, extrasensory perception, blah, blah, blah. He plays out in a lot of that and tries to get the evidence for it. Tries to subject it to experimental rigor and so on. But they just think he's nuts. In the book, he gave me one of the best quotes I've stumbled on so far. At the memorial service of Sir Francis Crick, his son said that it was my father's chief aim in life to drive the last nail into the coffin of vitalism. I thought, oh boy, you can't make it up.
Sheldrake is momentarily in the news for a big kerfluffle at TED. If you're all familiar with TED, the Technology, Entertainment, and Design, it's a very elite group. There's a lot of TED videos online. So Sheldrake did this TED talk where he talks about the science delusion, and there's a huge argument that goes online, and TED takes down his video because of the science's reaction to it. And recently it came back up. So the vitalist lives on a little bit.
Yeah, really. So that's how controversial it is.
Still to this day, right now, it's happening.
Okay, guys, what do you think?